The tetrapod radiation is that of four-footed vertebrates. These turn out to be interesting parallels in how the land surface was populated between tetrapods, arthropods, and land plants. Plants, for instance, take advantage of traits already present in aquatic green algae to get started on land. Tetrapods also benefit from features of their aquatic ancestors, the lobe-finned fishes like coelacanths and lungfish, to become at least partly terrestrial. The first tetrapods appear about 395 million years ago based on marine trackways in swamp and marsh sediments. These initial animals start with upward-looking eyes, ears adapted to an aquatic lifestyle, and lungs and feet. These animals, which are basically fish in most features, were lie-in-wait predators and used limbs to get around in vegetation-clogged waterways. Upward-pointing eyes also work in such places either because the fish are feeding on insects that are flying over the water, or because the fish are lying on the bottom, attacking insects, shrimps, or other fish swimming above them. Lungs were handy in this environment too, because swampy water bodies can get warm enough or sufficiently choked in decaying vegetation that dissolved oxygen can plunge to low levels. Now, one solution for a vertebrate is to gulp air, a strategy common in living fish and the tadpoles of amphibians. Of course, the classic story is that these shallow water bodies may also have completely dried up, requiring that early tetrapods be able to encase themselves in muddy cocoons and wait out dry periods in a damp burrow. This damp burrow approach is used by many living amphibians. For example, I used to live on Cape Cod, where we had a vernal pool across the street from my house. That is, an ephemeral pond that would dry up periodically. It would fill up with salamanders, spring peepers, which, by the way, are tiny but shrill frogs, and turtles. The frogs and the salamanders were active in the spring and early to midsummer. But then, as fall came on, they would march across the road into our wooded forest and burrow into the leaf litter, likely at least 6 to 10 inches below the ground surface. And there they'd go to sleep. Then they would sleep and sleep for months, all through the fall and the winter, emerging perhaps 6 or 8 months later in mid-March, when it was raining and the temperatures were just above freezing. I relate this story because it shows that amphibians have a strategy still of long-term residence in a state of reduced metabolic activity and shallow breathing that was probably perfected by their lungfish ancestors in the Devonian. A key point is that traits acquired as aquatic animals turn out to work really well in land animals. These features that evolve for one purpose but continue on in another context are called exaptations. That is, they are adaptations driven by selection that, say, requires a fish to gulp air in a hypoxic pond. But then those lungs turn out to be just what is needed to enable terrestrial lifestyle or to survive for months on end while buried in soil. The exaptations evolved for one purpose and are now redeployed for another purpose. I mentioned last time that arthropods set up a very odd ecosystem when they first emerged on land, namely one dominated by predators like spiders and centipedes that ate detritivores like millipedes and springtails, without a true herbivore to be seen. Arthropods found it a challenge to get enough nutrition from living plants to make herbivory worthwhile. The same thing happened to the tetrapods. The first tetrapods are all predators, probably because their immediate ancestors were predators, such as the fish. Predation also works because animal food is more enticing because of its higher food value than plants. The first amphibians probably dined on the same things that the arthropod predators were feasting on, namely other arthropods, other amphibians, and likely aquatic resources too, such as swimming arthropods, fish, and benthic invertebrates. Notably, there was not a tetrapod herbivore to be seen. Now, this predator-dominated tetrapod community lasts at least 50 million years, and perhaps more like 150 million years if we consider the tetrapod herbivores were not common at first. The first predator amphibians appear as body fossils about 375 million years ago. This date may understate their initial diversification because their trackways are earlier at 395 million years ago. From there, we see no widespread and large terrestrial herbivores until the Permian, 303 million years ago. Now, to be sure, the arthropods developed herbivory earlier, at about 325 million years ago, hence a complete trophic pyramid, from plants to herbivores to predators, evolves about 50 million years after the first tetrapod becomes active on land. Ecologists have talked about such systems as being upside down when predators vastly outnumber herbivores. Just pause for a moment and consider how odd this kind of ecosystem appears in our time. Both arthropods and tetrapods face the same problem, namely that it's hard to make a living eating plants. Arthropods got around this snag by eating decaying plants, and that strategy helped to prop up the rest of the terrestrial food web until arthropods figured out how to eat the plants directly, first by working on the energy-packed reproductive spores, and then dining on vegetable tissue directly. Much later in the Cretaceous, termites develop a gut microflora that can deal with lignin, and at that point wood itself becomes a valuable source of nutrition. But way before then, arthropods as herbivores propped up food webs for a good 25 million years until reptiles figured out how to make a living on plant material, at which point, somewhere around 300 million years ago, the modern trophic pyramid, with a broad base of herbivores and a small crown of predators, comes into existence. Like land plants, tetrapods also have problems becoming fully terrestrial by separating reproduction from liquid water. The amphibians, of course, were tethered to water by the need to lay eggs and develop as tadpoles for at least a few weeks in ponds and streams. But then, in an innovation similar to development of seeds in land plants, the tetrapods developed the amniote egg. These are self-contained eggs where the nutrition for the developing embryo and the gas exchange systems are all enclosed in a leathery or a mineralized shell. The eggs are usually laid in a damp place, like being buried in leaves, or they are kept humid and warm by the parents, or retained internally in the mother's body for live birth. The first egg-laying reptiles appear about 315 million years ago. After this, the innovations come hot and heavy. By the late Carboniferous, at 303 million years, we have fossils of the first omnivorous pelycosaurs, with flat, crushing teeth that may have fed on hard-shelled insects or the hard seeds and cones. About this time, reptile teeth appear with slicing incisors and shearing molars that imply the ability to feed on plant materials by grinding plants up and digesting the clippings in bulk in a reptile's stomach. A solution to the problem of eating plants turns out to be eating lots of them, crushing everything with shearing teeth and using bacteria in the animal's guts to digest the slurry. This is more or less what the Silurian arthropod detritivores were doing by letting bacteria work on decaying vegetation before slurping down the liquid. Now we can see these ecological changes in tetrapods by examining their head and postcranial morphology. Predators tend to have wide heads and jaws that allow them to take big prey and cut up their food with the side of their jaws. Here you can envision a cat that uses the big carnassial teeth in the side of its skull to shear up prey with the side of its mouth. Predators usually also have binocular vision. The jaws of predators are also distinctive. They tend to have a wide gape so that they can get large prey items down the predator's gullet. Opening the jaws wide is enabled by having the hinge joint at the very back of the jaw in line with the teeth. Finally, predators often have a large sagittal crest, a ridge of bone across the skull case where the muscles of the jaw attach to the skull. Muscles also engage the zygomatic arch, basically the cheekbone, that also helps to power the jaws. In contrast, herbivores tend to have narrower skulls with nipping teeth at the front of the skull for collecting vegetation and moving it to the tooth battery behind, which is a line of teeth broadly that grind up and crush the vegetation. The jaws of herbivores have a small gape since there's no need to open the mouth wide for a mouthful of leaves. Herbivores also tend to have the jaw joint out of line with the teeth to allow the jaw to move side to side and forward and back, both movements useful for grinding food. There's usually only a small sagittal crest on the skull, since the jaw muscles are usually not as large as those in predators. Finally, herbivores usually have eyes on the sides of their heads that gives the herbivore some vision to the rear, the most probable direction from which a predator might launch an attack. So, in summary, the first amphibians have a suite of traits they inherit directly from fish between, say, 375 and 395 million years ago. They're innovations that tetrapods developed specifically to deal with life on land, a notable one being the amniote egg. Notably, a predatory ecology persists for at least 50 million years after land tetrapods appear. And even after this, the herbivore ecology is supported by arthropods until nearly 300 million years ago. This problem of the low food value of plants is eventually solved by just processing plant material in bulk and using bacteria in the gut to digest the plant clippings. After the appearance of reptiles about 15 million years ago, the innovations come fast, with the development of distinct predator and herbivore traits, particularly in skull morphology. These innovations set the stage for the big split that leads on one hand to the synapsids, that happen to include us, and on the other to the diapsids, that eventually lead to the turtles, lizards, crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds.